Mic check, mic 1. Mic check, mic 2.
Well, hello, Internet. My name is Aaron Mehta. I am the Pentagon correspondent and associate editor with Defense News. We're a defense trade publication based out of D.C. We're going to do a couple of interviews here while our friends in the other room are having some kind of small informal discussions. And I'm lucky enough to start those with Dr. Kathleen Fisher from Tufts University, my alma mater, big fan.
Hello.
So thank you for taking time to chat. One of the things you talked about in your appearance earlier was a big focus on cybersecurity and AI and how those two kind of mingle together. And we were just talking before we came on camera about the question of perfect. Does cybersecurity have to be perfect? Does AI have to be perfect? When you consider the human factors, nobody's perfect. I just wanted to see if you riff a little bit on that and kind of whether you think some of the concerns about being perfect might actually impact the ability to develop these new technologies.
Yeah, indeed. So, security is all about usability. So you want to have a system that's secure enough to protect your assets, but not so secure that you can't actually use the system. I think an analogy here with the real world is really helpful, specifically like the security of your house, right? So you have a model of how secure you want your house to be. You probably lock all the doors and all the windows. You don't put deadbolts and multiple locks on the front door and leave the back door wide open. And you have a notion of contextual awareness of like, I live in a neighborhood that's perfectly safe for me to leave the door open all the time, no problem. Or no, I live in a neighborhood where I need to make sure I lock the door. Or sometimes it's fine for me to leave the door open, but other times because of events going on in town, it might not be so. So you have a kind of sophisticated awareness. Perfect security for a house might mean like everything is locked down so that if you like lose your key or you leave your key in the house, you can't get back in again without knocking down a wall or something. So that's like too much security. So we have in the real world intuitions about how much security is enough and getting the security to work for us. And those same ideas apply in the cybersecurity world, but we don't have we don't carry over those intuitions. We either expect it to be perfect or we like leave the back door wide open all the time. And I think it's important to apply the same kind of intuitions and rigor from the physical security world into the cybersecurity world. Like do the analysis of, have I left the back door open? Have I locked the windows? Am I in a particularly dangerous place where it's worth investing more in security, or have I made the system so secure that nobody can use it and I might as well, just destroy the whole system or like delete it for some other software? You also, in the question of autonomous systems and self-driving cars, right? I think the standard that we need to be applying for these systems is not, are the systems perfect? Will they have zero accidents? People have accidents all the time. I think there are 35,000 fatalities a year because of human error driving. So a better standard is, are computer-guided cars more secure than people? If we hold them to the standard that they can't ever make a mistake, then we're not going to be able to adopt the technology, and we might actually have more fatalities as a result because we're too cautious in adopting the technology.
But how do you get that argument across? Because that's an argument that makes sense in a logical way, but this is an emotional issue for a lot of people, especially when you get into start saying, oh, well, then the robots are going to take over and eat us all.
Well, I mean, I think, again, right, these are robots, self-driving cars with a very specific purpose. So I think you need to, again, contextualize the threat, right? The threat is not that they're going to take over all of society. There is an economic threat to certain parts of economic sector, but it's really, self-driving cars. And I think you explain it to people, and you explain it to people in a way that makes sense. So people are familiar with, they're not always perfect at driving cars, and, Uncle Henry or whatever in your family, like you never want to get in the car with Uncle Henry. It's like, wouldn't you rather have the autopilot driving than Uncle Henry? I mean, I think that you can cast the narrative in a way that people like, oh yeah, I see that framing it in terms of the perfect driver is less good for me and for society than phrasing it in terms of overall we can improve the system. And yeah, it will be tragedy when those tragedies happen, but we have those tragedies now, and I think the promise is that we'll have fewer of those tragedies, and that's a goal worth striving for.
I want to focus on cybersecurity for a second, because there's some talk about, are we nearing a turning point in cybersecurity? Are we getting to the point where a lot of the stuff that's been theoretical or maybe kind of in its infancy starts to become the norm? And I'd just like to get your take on that.
I'm not sure the norm. There's been a narrative for a long time that we don't know how to build systems that are secure. We just can't do it. So why bother trying? Like a whole conversation about trying to build systems that are super hard to hack into or parts of which have been verified is too hard. So go away and let me go build my system.
Right.
And what the HACMS program at DARPA showed is that no, we actually can build systems that are built to a much higher standard of correctness, that have proofs for part of the system, that they do what they're supposed to, that they don't do other things, that many of the kinds of attacks that hackers like to use will not work. which doesn't say that others won't, but they're much harder to hack into. So that's a proof of concept that says, no, we can do this. And once we have these, what I call exquisite artifacts, which are sort of core building blocks that are proven to a very high standard of correctness, we can leverage those to build much larger systems where most of the system is built to today's standard of correctness. But because they're built and architected out of these exquisite pieces, we can still get security guarantees about the whole system that are much better than what we have today. So given that we now know how to do this, and the HACMS program showed that we could do this, now it's more a question of the will. Like, are we going to do this, and who will be motivated to do this, and under what circumstances?
We heard a lot today about the arms race, quote unquote. And Eric Schmidt from Google kind of said, I don't know that I agree there's an arms race. There's people developing it, but it's not necessarily China versus the US in this stuff. There's many actors. Other people said, that's a great in theory, but we know that's not necessarily how the countries are looking at it. Do you have any particular strong opinions about that?
In terms of malware and cyber warfare and things like that?
Yeah, I think, and AI and everything. I mean,
So I think that there's lots of different kinds of populations. So I think that AI researchers aren't necessarily working or thinking about an arms race. I think they're just working on doing the best research they know how to do and publishing the best papers and advancing science as much as they know how to do. And there it's largely a collaborative effort, modulo issues of data being locked inside of corporations that make it so that everything isn't open. But in terms of cyber warfare and developing malware that can be used for nation-state kinds of objectives, or in general, hacking and cyberspace attacks, I think that's an environment where there's clearly an arms race going on. It's been an arms race all along. I don't think there's any reason to think that the arms race isn't continuing. But indeed, it's not just the U.S. and China. It's the U.S. and China and Russia and North Korea and many other players. And there, I think it's really vying for like the viability of the nation state. Right? I think that in the future, warfare will be fought in addition to the current arenas in a cyber arena as well. And if we don't invest in that, and our adversaries do, and they develop capabilities beyond what we can do, we could lose in a conflict before it even starts. Right? You can have, a country can have in place hacked infrastructure and military systems and just kind of be sleepers waiting for an activation command. And if you get into a conflict and your adversary can just push the button and take out your power grid, kind of game over, right? So I think in that setting there is an arms race going on. I mean, it's the same arms race that's been going on forever in terms of nation states. It's just on a different arena.
how concerned are you, or how concerned do you think people should be about non-state actors in that arms race?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing. Cyber really brings in the ability of non-state actors to play in that space where before you can't compete with a nation state in building an aircraft carrier or satellite system. But in cyber, the cost of developing a cyber weapon varies. I mean, some of them are super expensive, but other ones are much more cost effective and can be done by a relatively small number of people, which brings into things like anonymous and hacker collectives and things like that. So or terrorist organizations. And so it's a brave new world out there where I think we're just learning what's possible and who can do what.
Along those lines, I mean, we hear a lot about the weaponization of these technologies, and certainly throughout the day we've heard a lot about things like autonomous cars and big data identification projects, which are not necessarily militarized, they're not necessarily defense focused. Obviously you did work with DARPA, you've continued to research into this area. Are we at the point where militarized AI in particular, obviously cybersecurity has been used at this point, we know cyber attacks happen, but AI, is that a militarized aspect that's being used in combat today?
I don't know. I mean, certainly aspects of it, sure, right? We have autonomous drones that are flying over military regions using video and processing and image processing, sensor input kinds of things that are definitely pulling on machine learning algorithms. I think that's different than kind of what we think of as a cyber AI system that's sort of taking charge and making decisions. I don't know if that's deployed at the moment. I think that it will be in the future, whether it is or now or not.
That seems fair. The last question I'll ask you, the ethics question.
Yeah, okay.
There's a lot of questions about how you control these things, how you train, especially AI and algorithms like that. Where do you come down in the question of what kind of constraints should we put on AI as it's trying to learn and we're trying to teach these things, and how to direct it?
Yeah, so in terms of the research, I don't think it's productive to put in constraints or limitations. I think that that will only handicap us with respect to our adversaries, and because of the arms race nature of it, I think we will lose if we do that. So I think we need to be unfettered doing research in this area. In terms of deployment, I think that working on ethics systems and computational ethics systems is a really important part. So as we do research into these systems, I think one of the things that we should be doing research on is this ethics system idea. I don't think it's possible to only use reinforcement learning to train a system so that it will always behave ethically. I don't think we'll have enough training data, for example. We won't be able to anticipate all of the situations that we need to train for the system to be able to respond ethically. It won't have a complete set of training for all possible ethical situations. So I think that means we have to also build, I think we should do that, but I think we should also build a kind of monitoring framework for when it gets in a situation that it doesn't know what to do, how does it decide what action to take? And I think it's really important that it log that decision. So like afterwards, there's kind of a black box that gets recovered where there can be an audit to say like, well, why did it do what it did? If it had only bad choices, were we happy with the bad choice that it made and why it made it? Could we decide, yes, this was a terrible thing, but it did the best that it could, or yes, this was a terrible thing, I think maybe it did the wrong thing, I'm not sure, or no, it totally did the wrong thing. We need to change the ethical framework, or we need to change the training thing, or we need to change it so we'll never do this again. This is the same kind of thing we do with systems that are operated by humans, right? We trust them. Something happens, and then we go and audit to figure out, did the human make a mistake? Was the system wrong? How do we fix it so this won't happen again? I think we'll need to have the same kind of framework for the AI systems that we have for people.
All right, I had one quick follow-up.
Sure.
You mentioned how there has to be basically work done after to examine, see how these things went, see how it learned. Is there enough communication between the commercial sector, the defense sector, the parts of the national security sector, and even internationally, people who are researching this, to be able to get the kind of information, the big numbers and facts to learn if we're doing this right or not?
I think that probably we don't actually have enough information. It's certainly not made public, so many companies keep the information within themselves. The government certainly keeps the information, military things within. So the question isn't necessarily does all of society have access to it, but is there a reasonable board that sort of society as a whole is willing to trust, who has access to it, who can make a decision and explain that decision to the relevant collection of people in a way that we're willing to accept.
All right. Well, Dr. Kathleen Fisher, Tufts University, we appreciate the time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And we're going to work on getting our next guest in here as Dr. Fisher makes a smooth exit here. Our next guest is going to be Dr. Jeff Clune. He's the University of Wyoming. You may have, if you've been paying attention to the live stream, you probably heard him just before this. He was part of the panel that finished up just as we started. And he's going to walk in right now, pick up a microphone, and we'll just start going.
Thank you for the invitation. Hello, everybody.
See, he's a pro. This is great. All right. Well, Dr. Clune, lovely to see you.
Hello. Thank you.
We'll dive right into it. A lot of your work is focused on spoofing and basically ways that a bad actor could feed bad data into an AI learning and how that could impact things. Things like, an example that was used earlier during your panel was somebody says this empty street, it's actually a street full of children and a car drives through it. Mm-hmm. I guess based on the research you've done up top, are people starting to experiment with doing this kind of spoofing now, and how much of a concern is it for those focused particularly on the military side?
Yeah, sure. So the short answer is that people have done a lot of experimentation to show that these concerns are not merely academic curiosities, but they're relatively pervasive and easy to enact. So people have, for example, taken systems that recognize, say, a stop sign, and this is work out of Don Song's lab at the University of Berkeley. They have kind of gotten stickers. People frequently put stickers on a stop sign that says like "Stop Hate," for example. Right. And they could just put on a sticker that says "Stop Hate," but embedded in that sticker is a pattern that makes a system, for example, on a self-driving car that knows how to recognize stop signs to see that as a speed limit 75 miles an hour or 40 miles an hour. So the exact opposite of what you'd want, which is that the car should stop. It'll actually say, "Oh, I should speed up," and maybe rush through an intersection. As I mentioned in my talk, today. People have put on glasses that can have patterns on them that fool a face recognition system into thinking that, say, I am a certain actress, or that you're a grandmother, etc. And there's example after example after example where these systems, which are extremely powerful, are also extremely foolable and hackable, and therefore manipulatable. And so it's a real concern, and many people have been trying to solve this problem, and so far it's resisted the best minds for years, as I mentioned. And so basically the research challenge is on to try to solve the problem, but also for people who are actively deploying it to think about and recognize that these problems exist. And so you should not rely on the fact that your system is perfect, and if you have an adversary, you should be especially careful.
So that's one of the things that I'm kind of curious about, is the question of perfect versus good. Dr. Fisher mentioned a couple of times about how people aren't perfect, and people make mistakes, and we're hold automation to a certain level as maybe an unfair standard compared to people. At the same time, if the idea is you take some of the stuff out of people's hands, you have to be able to trust that. So what's the balance? How do you find the sweet spot between needing to be completely correct and accurate and making it realistic for use?
Yeah, well, I think it very much depends on the application and the consequences of when something goes wrong. So if Facebook is trying to figure out whether or not I like pictures of surfing versus pictures of food, it doesn't really matter if it messes up. Now, there may be some adversary, like a person who's trying to game the system and get some sort of unwanted ad through their filters or something, and so there can be consequences. I don't want to pretend that there aren't. But it's obviously different than, for example, a self-driving car, or a system that is denying loans to people or sentencing people to longer sentences. And so I think, in some systems, you are okay with empirical estimates of reliability. So if I could, for example, make a self-driving car, and I knew that it was better than humans at driving by a few orders of magnitude, and I could show that over a tremendous amount of miles, maybe you'd trust it even though it's not perfect, because we're not perfect either. And if the system statistically is better, then that's fine. But as you see in the realm of, for example, computer security, a system might look pretty good for a very long period of time until suddenly somebody steals all your money. Well, that's not okay. There's tremendous consequences to the one-off error there, and therefore then it's not about kind of statistical reliability. It might be more about formal methods that prove that the system is unhackable. So it's hard to give a blanket answer to the question, and every person who's deploying these systems needs to think very carefully about the ways that their system can be hacked and exploited and the consequences of failure.
Particularly when it comes to military systems. I mean, how do you build in the type of security and capability you need to be able to trust? We've heard a lot, this won't be used to decide strike at this point is a big thing. There's always a human there for strike, but the data collection and the data processing that determines who to be struck is something that could be impacted by this. So from a DoD perspective or foreign defense minister perspective, how concerning is the idea of this challenge, and how do you try to match that challenge?
Yeah, well, I just want to quickly raise that for things like that, even if you're not striking, but you're just kind of analyzing and trying to detect potential targets or potential suspects, that you have to not only worry about false positives, which is when you call somebody a target or a person of interest when they're not, but probably more interestingly, you have to worry about false negatives. So, for example, I can make the system not detect that I'm a bad actor by carefully fooling and layering in some information that prevents them from seeing me for who I am if I'm a person on a watch list, or seeing my pattern of behavior as malicious or suspicious when it obviously is, by using some of these techniques. Again, you just kind of have to recognize that the systems are imperfect, and you want to think about ways to use them and harness their benefits to the best that you can, while thinking about the potential downsides. So a system that serves up suggestions of things to look into, things to analyze more, is a pretty good system until you start assuming that it's always suggesting all the things that you need to look at. And there's just no simple answer. These are tools. They're imperfect tools, just like imperfect humans. You give a job to a certain employee. They're going to do a pretty good job, hopefully. They're not going to do a perfect job. And you never assume that. So maybe you give it to a bunch of people. Maybe you do some random checking and selection. And generally you just game and plan for the fact that you are dealing with imperfect tools.
I mean, along those lines, then, how do you deal with potential distrust from people who are using these things? How do you get over the point of people saying, well, these aren't perfect, we can't be totally sure, I don't feel as comfortable trusting a machine as if I just checked it myself?
Yeah, I think that comes down to just empirical reliability. If you have a system that's been reliable for a very long time and it's better than your best employee, then you're probably going to use it. There may be some human factors. Some people may be more distrustful, some people less. But I think ultimately it kind of shows just like a running track record. And this is probably true with you. Probably the first time you engaged cruise control, you were pretty suspicious.
Right.
Probably the first time you engaged the kind of cruise control that automatically brakes when there's a car in front of you, you were probably pretty suspicious. After you saw it work like 1,000 times, you probably just kind of assume that it's going to work. Now, there can be problems. It could fail, and it could cause an accident. So, this is just kind of a very tough area where as the systems get better, we trust them more, and then they fail once in a while, and we are complacent. So that same lesson of the car driving, it applies to every deployment of this AI technology, and there's not much we can do about it.
Last one I'll ask you about this. You mentioned during the panel the idea of hubris, that it's hubris to say at some point machines won't be able to eclipse us and essentially be able to do stuff. We won't even understand what they're doing, but they're processing this at a higher level than we'll be able to handle. Is that likely to come anytime soon? And how, especially again on a military side where some of these decisions are life or death, how does that play out?
Yeah, so the history of technological predictions is littered with false predictions. Typically, people are a bit too aggressive when they make predictions. But usually people, because they were too aggressive, write off the prediction, and the prediction ends up coming true just a little bit down the road, or maybe a lot bit down the road. It's 2017, we still don't have flying cars and jetpacks, but we almost have flying cars and jetpacks deployed at scale. They're coming actually relatively soon. So it's very hard to know when this will happen. It's very hard to know, and it won't be a binary event. There are cases now where AI is better. Like our computers have been better than humans at multiplying large numbers since the dawn of computers.
Right.
And now, in many cases, like deep neural networks are better than doctors at looking at medical images and detecting whether or not there's malignant or benign tumors, at least at scale, where humans become fatigued and they become bored, et cetera. So it's kind of like, it's basically going to be a slow, steady march of AI becoming increasingly more competent than us in an increasing number of areas. But there also could be a nonlinear event where suddenly the pieces come together in the right way in the software, and we've seen, for example, in AlphaGo Zero, the most recent paper and some recent work by AI, that AI playing itself can actually teach itself very rapidly how to do something amazing. So as was said earlier today, humans have been playing Go for around 2,500 years. AI played itself and figured out how to beat the best human player in 7 days. It didn't have access to the books that human read, to 40 years of experience, or however old the champion was, et cetera. It figured out in 7 days how to do something that's taken us, centuries, or millennia, actually, to do well at. So there could be a nonlinear event. Eventually, AI teaches itself and suddenly becomes really good. And, it's probably not, it's not really a question of, is it extremely likely? I think the more interesting question is there a decent probability of that happening? And if so, we probably should be spending a lot of time thinking about it, because even a low probability of something that might be civilization ending is something that we should spend some time on.
All right, well, on that happy note,
Exactly.
There you go. Jeff Clune is with the University of Wyoming, and we're going to get our next guest in here. Jeff, thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, so our next and final guest, is Amir Hussain. Amir is the CEO of Spark Cognition, and he's also the new author of a new book called The Sentient Machine, which you can tell from the title hits on a lot of the same points that we've been talking about here today. So Amir is coming in now. We're going to just hand him his mic.
Thank you.
Amir, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
I want to start with the big picture easy question for you.
Sure.
Are AIs already active in warfare?
Within artificial intelligence, there are two classifications that are worth thinking about. There's artificial general intelligence, which is sort of human-level AI that can solve general-purpose problems. And then there's artificial narrow intelligence, which is pretty good human-level, sometimes even better than human-level, at a specific narrow task. And I would say that probably ANI systems of some types are active or at least experimentally deployed. This is just my view. But certainly not AGI systems, because AGI systems are not known to exist.
So you recently wrote a paper called Hyperwar with General John Allen, where you hit on some of these topics. And one of the things that you guys talked about was the question of how is AI going to play out in the future in conflict. For readers and listeners who maybe haven't had a chance to check the article out, can you just kind of sum that article up quickly
Sure.
for people?
So I think one of the huge changes that AI will drive in the future of war is this ability to separate decision making from the human mind. And what that means is that when you combine the ability to replicate these systems that have AI running on them, I mean, there can be billions upon billions of these small embedded systems that are making decisions either at the edge or in the cloud. You really have this federated, completely distributed way of making decisions that can all be synchronized, that can all plan. And that kind of synchrony, that kind of coordination, that kind of rapidity in decision making has simply not ever existed on the field of battle. That's one. And the second major thing is that AI can be used to create this pretty immense David versus Goliath effect. And by that, what I mean is that you may be a smaller force, but with the rapid decision making and the rapid action capability that AI imbues you, you can operate perpetually inside the OODA loop of your enemy, inside the observe, orient, decide, act loop of your enemy, and before they can even get a sense of what the heck's going on, you've already inflicted kinetic damage. So that tightening of the OODA loop. Now, of course, the paper had many other aspects, but
Sure.
these two, I think, bring out some of the more important things for this video, at least.
Well, I think that brings up an interesting question, which has been touched on a little bit throughout today, which is the question of, is AI going to augment humanity and augment human capabilities, or replace them and just simply do them better than humans can do themselves?
For the foreseeable future, I think in many scenarios, it'll be a question of augmentation. But, it's a very nuanced question because, for example, when you create an autonomous car, is that augmentation or replacement? If you ask the driver of the vehicle, it's replacement.
Right.
But if you ask the passenger that now gets to do many other things in the time that he or she would otherwise have spent driving with all that concentration, it's augmentation. So there is that fine balance. In some contexts, I feel that the OODA loops, and I'm coming back to the realm of battle, I think in some contexts the OODA loops will be so tight that I don't believe there'll be much room for human input in every such decision-making loop. I think that humans will still provide commander's intent. I think humans will still authorize modes of engagement, autonomous, semi-autonomous, or manual, for these systems for the foreseeable future. But in certain contexts, just like today we have the Phalanx CIWS system where in a 2.5 mile radius for a certain class of threat, such as sea-skimming cruise missiles or small approaching aircraft that are on a collisionary trajectory, these systems will autonomously take them out. So it's a very small scope of enablement for autonomy, and we know that that already works and that's already happening. But I think you'll see that expand, number one. Number two, as they say, the enemy also gets a vote. Right. So if you now have someone that you're dealing with on a near peer level that's creating a capability that's perpetually putting your OODA cycle at risk by being inside it, you must counter that. Otherwise, you're done.
One of the questions that was brought up earlier today was the question of if the U.S. is in an arms race with China or another near-peer competitor with this type of technology. And there's some disagreement about whether that's the case or not, because not everyone sees it necessarily in the battle head-to-head situation. Where do you come down in that particular question?
I think that artificial intelligence is so broadly applicable that to characterize the AI race as purely an arms race is to miss the forest and only see the trees. I think that AI will enable economic dominance, economic advantages in healthcare, and therefore betterment of your population, of your citizenry. I think AI will improve planning and can create can restore public spaces to the citizenry by creating management systems for autonomous vehicles that drastically cut down the amount of land that we have to repurpose as parking lots and highways and so on and so forth. My company is working with some of the largest energy companies in the world to improve their efficiency and cut down on their unintended failures so that you can make alternate energy cheaper and more efficient. So AI is so broadly applicable, and I've even just only barely scratched the surface. That to dimensionalize it and then to think about it only as a military technology would be, I think, excessive. There's no real reason to do that. However, if you look at the history of technology development, say in this country, many of the compelling technologies that made their way into the civilian domain did come with a lot of they came from the military sphere, whether DARPA funded them or whether they arose of a need in SAC or
Famously, the internet is the classic example.
Yeah, exactly. ARPA, and then that later became DARPA. They did the internet, but many of the technologies in the cell phone, GPS, was a weapon of war. I mean, was a technology for the pursuit of war. The fastest jet engines, the most advanced designs for aircraft. So I feel that there's a huge connection between the kind of innovation that the defense community has put forth and its subsequent commercialization. Artificial intelligence is probably the most broadly applicable technology that one can cite, even in history. So given that that's the case, of course, defense is still, given the nature of man and given man's lot thus far on this earth, clearly military affairs are a big percentage of what concerns man. We hope that wars diminish and suffering ends and no two countries ever enter into a kinetic fight with each other. But until those things happen, the technologies of war also are a deterrent. So until we resolve the issue of the intent of man to not have the correct deterrents in place is also probably not the best idea.
We're starting to hit against the clock, unfortunately, but I wanted to take a minute that we have left and just talk to you briefly about the book that's coming out, The Sentient Machine.
Yeah.
Obviously relevant to what we're talking about. That comes out fairly soon, correct?
Yes, it actually starts shipping the 21st of November, 2017, and the first book launch event, there's going to be a tour, but the first event is happening in Austin, Texas at Book People on the 20th of November.
All right, so a little Christmas stocking stuffer there.
That's right.
30 seconds, just lay out the book.
I, thought about what a book on AI would look like if it was written with the kind of thinking that, say, the Greek philosophers employed when they contemplated questions. Existential on the one hand, scientific on the other, and very personal. It really talks about my own journey, my own love and affection for this whole notion of computing and the potential that artificial intelligence holds. And there are several arguments. I think many readers will find some new things in there. But one of the arguments is that in giving birth to artificial intelligence, we are realizing our potential. And in trying to place curbs on it, we are actually taking away from our own capacity as great builders and great inventors. And if we do that, we'll do that out of fear. So my view is that AI is now part of us. It's now part of this universe. And for philosophical reasons and scientific practical reasons, I advocate that we should continue to invest in it. But you'll find some personal vignettes. You'll find lots of AI application stories, which we are, my company and I are personally involved with. And I intended it for it to be a little bit of a different book on AI, and I think it's pretty close.
All right. Well, Amir Hussain is the CEO of Spark Recognition and the author of the new upcoming book, The Sentient Machine, which, if AI is doing its job, has probably already been ordered for you on Amazon. So, Amir, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And folks, that's it for our little interview segment here. Again, I'm Aaron Mehta with Defense News. We're going to take you back to the main CNAS event. Thanks for watching.